Okay, let's get started. Uh, I'm Waite Rawls. I'm co-CEO of the American Civil War Museum. Thanks all of you for being here. We're going to talk about Lincoln's election in 1864, and it's interesting. We try, if we can, to make dates correspond with the Sesquicentennial, and he was elected 150 years ago this month, and in a fairly interesting time and series of events. But let's go ahead and get started. A year ago yesterday, we announced the creation of the American Civil War Museum with a combination of the Museum of the Confederacy and the American Civil War Center at historic Tredegar. One of the results has been a complete review of our interpretive plan. And as we've moved through that, we've engaged a fabulous group of historians to work with us. And one of the themes that they've tried to drive home to us is that looking back at history, we tend to believe that all of the outcomes were inevitable. You know, it happened, therefore it was meant to happen, therefore it was going to happen. But history is not... history is recorded looking backward, but it's made looking forward. And human beings are capable of forming opinions and changing those opinions quickly. And events can overcome seemingly predictable outcomes. I think perhaps nothing more in the Civil War illustrates this than the election of 1864. In the popular narrative of today, you know, if you get the man or woman on the street, Abraham Lincoln was loved and followed by all people in the North. He was a hero. He was Father Abraham to 6 million enslaved people in the South, the man who would lead them to freedom. He was the commander-in-chief who would lead them to victory on the battlefield. But the events of the spring and summer of 1864 seemed to be moving steadily to a Republican defeat in the middle of the war. The North voting Lincoln out of office, leading to the end of the war on a peaceful basis with the possibility of two countries rather than one, and slavery continuing in the South perhaps for decades to come, a Southern victory. In 1864, November, an election loomed, a truly astounding event, a full Democratic, small d Democratic vote in the middle of a war that had torn apart the country. This had never happened before. And it's incredible still today that it happened 150 years ago last Saturday. And on the 8th of November, 1864, Lincoln did win, overwhelmingly. And the war continued for 5 more months until the Confederate armies surrendered and we reunited as one country. So what happened to change the predicted outcome in the 2 intervening months? It's clear that the election was going to be all about the North's willingness to continue to fight. It's almost an impossibility for the South to win the war. The North had to decide not to win the war to end it. Lincoln and the Republicans were focused on pressing on, despite all costs, to victory, to emancipation and to reunification. The Democrats would hold their convention at the end of August in Chicago, in the land of Lincoln, and they would nominate George McClellan. Now, those of you who know the war well know that McClellan and Lincoln weren't best buddies, and they weren't best buddies formally, and they weren't best buddies then. But the Democrats themselves, the Northern Democrats, were split between peace Democrats and war Democrats, with McClellan trying to straddle the fence between these two factions in his own party. Would he negotiate a peace with the Union intact or simply stop the war? You know, what was the position of the Democratic Party? Well, we're not sure even today because it depended on who you asked. To the general electorate, though, the choice was clear. The choice of presidents was, do we want to keep fighting or stop fighting? I mean, that's the issue. Do we want to keep fighting or stop fighting? So what were people thinking? Many people today, especially some academic historians, and I disagree with a lot of academic historians, try to separate the battlefront of the Civil War from the home front. You can't do it. The two are so inextricably intertwined because events on the battle are affecting attitudes at home, and attitudes at home are affecting events on the battle. The northern people at home and the politicians in Washington were thinking first and foremost about the war. Everything else was trivial in comparison. Their moods would swing widely with successes and failures in battles. And in May, June, and July of 1864, what they were seeing was failure. In Virginia, Robert E. Lee had punished Grant over and over again in the Overland Campaign. The geographical advances of the Army of the Potomac were overlooked as people in the North were focusing on the huge human toll. In those 3 months, May, June, and July, Grant had suffered over 60,000 casualties and earned the nickname of the Butcher. Now, how many of you are from Virginia? Okay, this will relate a little more clearly to you, but those of you who have been watching the press lately may appreciate it also. In the very recent unpleasantness in Virginia, our First Lady was called a nutbag. This is Bob McDonnell's wife. In the testimony, somebody called her a nutbag. But the real nutbag First Lady in history was married to Lincoln. And she was calling Grant a butcher. At the Wilderness, in Spotsylvania Courthouse, at the North Anna, at Cold Harbor, and even in the approaches to Petersburg, Grant's men were advancing, but at a terrible cost. They were losing about 1,000 men for every mile they advanced. And just think about that, 1,000 men per mile. By the end of June, they were bogged down in a siege. In July, they suffered a humiliating defeat at the Crater. And the performance of U.S. colored troops there put a huge crack in the Northern hope that the swelling numbers of black soldiers could effectively make up the gaps in the ranks caused by the casualties and also by the large number of Union troops who simply were not re-upping. Their enlistment had expired, and they said, okay, I've done my part, or I disagree with what we're doing now, or my wife needs me, but I'm going home rather than staying in the Army. In the Valley, the noble, valiant, courageous VMI cadets. I did go to VMI for those of you who didn't. So the noble, valiant, courageous VMI cadets, coupled with a couple of thousand of real Confederate veterans under the command of former U.S. Vice President John Breckinridge, had delivered a defeat to the army of Franz Sigel. When the Yankees returned under David Hunter a month later, Jubal Early's Second Corps was sent to Lynchburg and sent Hunter and his army reeling into the mountains west of Lynchburg and Big Lick. I love that name. It was the former name of Roanoke was Big Lick. Worse yet, on July the 12th, old Jube was at Fort Stevens in the outskirts of Washington, firing at, you guessed it, Abraham Lincoln, who was standing in the fortifications, causing Oliver Wendell Holmes to exclaim, quote, "Get down, you damn fool," not realizing the target of his shot. But the election was only 120 days away. And here's Lincoln being shot at in the outskirts of Washington. In Louisiana, Nathaniel Banks' campaign up the Red River had come right back down the Red River in embarrassing defeat as U.S. President Zachary Taylor's son, Richard Taylor, had outsmarted, outflanked, and outfought the former Speaker of the U.S. Congress and Governor of Massachusetts. William Tecumseh Sherman had indeed advanced into Georgia from Chattanooga, but had suffered a costly defeat on June 27th at Kennesaw Mountain. A month later, like Grant, he was bogged down in a siege in Atlanta. Nathan Bedford Forrest had been up in western Kentucky in the spring. And in a separate raid in June, John Hunt Morgan had almost visited his hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, in eastern Kentucky. So the stuff is just, it's not looking good. On the civilian side, the national debt was running through the roof. The administration's blatant violations of constitutional rights were being lambasted in the press, and resistance to the draft was running at a fever pitch. So what were the Northern people thinking? Many were thinking, this just isn't worth it. Let's stop it. And the log splitter isn't the guy who's going to do that. We need somebody new. And a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats, even the Republicans were talking about nominating somebody different instead of Lincoln. They were talking about either nominating Samuel Chase or John Fremont. And think of that, your own party is not going to renominate you for a change. But not only was the Republican Party split, but some Democrats were siding with the Republicans who wanted to continue the war. So the Republican Party, in order to get support of the war Democrats, renamed themselves the National Union Party to try to pick up some of that centrist vote. And who did Lincoln choose as his running mate but Andrew Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat. I mean, he was a Democrat, loyal to the Union, but a Democrat from Tennessee. As a matter of fact, what was Lincoln thinking? Well, August 23rd, now this is late, August 23rd, he penned a now famous memo to his cabinet saying, quote, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, between the 1st of November and the middle of March, when long gap there, as he will have secured his election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." Now think about this. This is Lincoln saying, okay, we're not going to get reelected, fellas, so we're going to have to end the war between November and March, because they won't, so we're going to have to. So again, what happened? Let me reiterate. The people were carefully watching the battlefields. And what happened between August and November? Well, Mobile Bay fell to Farragut's naval flotilla. By the way, one of the great questions in history is when Farragut comes into Mobile Bay, did he really say, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," or did he say, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead"? Okay, but Mobile Bay fell to Farragut. In the Valley, Sheridan won 3 battles at 3rd Winchester, at Fisher's Hill, and convincingly at Cedar Creek in September and October. In the breadbasket of the Confederacy was firmly in Union hands, burned up pretty badly, but firmly in Union hands. It was out of commission for the Confederacy. But far more important than anything else, Sherman took Atlanta in early September. The New York Times even claimed that Sherman and Farragut's activities, that they were, and the quote is, they were electioneering in the South, because what they were doing was influencing the election, and that Grant was, quote unquote, on the stump in Virginia. Grant had not made much geographical progress, and had suffered 15,000 more casualties in August, September, October. But the Battle of Newmarket Heights was very important on September the 29th, and it was important because it highlighted a victory won by U.S. colored troops. And so if U.S. colored troops are part of our northern way to victory, look, they actually can win battles. And 14 men, 14 African Americans were given the Medal of Honor in that battle, the most to any one group in any battle in the Civil War. Now, it doesn't take a genius to know that politics had something to do with that. They wanted to honor the colored troops, to get a splash in the newspaper that says, yes, indeed, this will this will bring victory. Okay. And again, you got to think, this is September the 29th was the battle. The Medal of Honor were awarded the following week. The election's 30 days away. So you're very conscious of what those newspaper headlines are saying about what's going on the battlefront. Suddenly, victory seemed within the grasp of the northern people, and the awful mood of June and July had been replaced with "we can win" mood, and Lincoln's election prospects zoomed from gloomy to almost assured. When Election Day results came in, McClellan carried only 3 states: New Jersey, Kentucky, and Delaware. And again, remember that Kentucky and Delaware were slave states, still slave states. And amazingly, the soldiers in the Army were allowed to vote, far from home. And Lincoln did carry 78% of the soldier vote. That latter record is a little marred because 20% of the soldiers refused to vote. Now, you know that you wouldn't have refused to vote if you were going to vote for Lincoln. And in many units, there was widespread pressure on the soldiers to vote for Lincoln. But regardless of even if Lincoln had carried 50% of the soldier vote, he was going to win the Electoral College. The message of the election was clear. The war would be pressed on to its conclusion. And speaking of conclusions, that's the conclusion of my talk, and let's do Q&A now.